For those who I haven't already met, I am Claire Hunter and I am the founder and director of Red Harbour. Red Harbour are a policy-driven events company focusing exclusively on the issues which affect children and people in Scotland, young people in Scotland. I'm not a big one for marketing speak, but Red Harbour ethos is involving people shaping policy. And given the turnout we've had for this event today, we've certainly managed the former at the very least. We're delighted to have so many attendees from across Scotland here today. The demand for this event has far outstripped my expectations, and I thank you all for joining us. I think that this level of interest from across professionals in education, child protection, early years and beyond demonstrates that there is already some understanding of the importance of adopting a relationship-based approach to our interactions with children and young people, and an appetite to learn more. This event was already scheduled to take place as a traditional conference last month before COVID-19 made its presence felt in such a devastating way. We still intend for that event to take place when it's safe to do so, and as anyone online with us today who has originally registered for that event knows, we now have a November date for that to happen. For me personally though, the importance of having that conversation about a relationship-based approach to interact with young people to tackle some of the challenges posed by COVID-19 was such that I felt it was important to hold this virtual forum in the meantime. I'm delighted to welcome our three expert panellists for today's session. We have Bruce Adamson, the Children and Young People's Commissioner in Scotland, Maureen McAteer, Assistant Director in Attainment for Barnardo, Scotland, and Eileen Pryor, Executive Director, Connect, formerly the Scottish Parent Teacher Council. Before we begin, just a little bit of housekeeping. First of all, as mentioned in the confirmation emails for attendees, which you will have received, this session is being recorded. All microphones and videos will be muted and off and will remain so for the duration of the session. You will only see myself and each speaker as they are presenting. We've allocated an hour and a half to today's session with the focus to be on the Q&A element. If you have not submitted a question as yet, we are inviting questions via the chat box at the bottom of the screen. You will be able to ask to panellists only or panellists and attendees, with the latter being visible to everyone in the session. So if you just want your question to be seen by the panellists, please use panellists only. If you don't want your question to be anonymous, please state your name and if there is a specific speaker you are directing your question to, or to the whole panel. Questions will be posed to the panel in the Q&A session after all three speakers have presented. We have produced an anonymous poll with 4 multiple choice questions for you to answer to give us further feedback. These will be posted after the 3 speakers have presented and before the Q&A session. Please be aware when wording any questions or statements that there may be children watching. So without further ado, I'm delighted to welcome the Commissioner for Children and Young People Scotland, Bruce Adamson. Thank you, Bruce.
I think my audio is working, but my video not yet. Aha, right. Thank you so much, Claire, and welcome everybody. Particularly pleased that there are a number of children and young people attending as well, because I have the best job in the world as the Children and Young People's Commissioner for Scotland. It's my role to promote and safeguard the rights of the over 1 million children and young people across Scotland. So I get to spend my days usually climbing trees and splashing in rivers and attending schools and finding out what's really important to children and young people, but also working closely with parents, with teachers and others to make sure that we fulfill our rights to children. I am just noticing a thing in the chat. Can people hear me and see me okay? Yes, okay, we're getting a yes. Thank you, everybody. Well, that's lovely. I'm getting lots of yeses. Right. 2 months ago, the United Nations warned of the grave physical, emotional, and psychological effects of children of the COVID-19 pandemic. We know that the pandemic is having a disproportionate impact on those children and young people and families whose rights were already most at risk, particularly those impacted by poverty and social exclusion, or those with additional support needs, particularly children with disability. Alongside the loss of their formal education, we're seeing an impact on children's mental health and their development through loss of opportunities for socialization with friends and family, and lost opportunities to engage in cultural life. And we know that those relationships are so essential to children and young people's development. It's also important to realize that children and young people experiencing time differently to our adults. The time that they are losing now, they'll not be able to get back. Those missed birthday parties, graduations, concerts, and school trips, which are so important, it's such a formative part of their development, they really matter. We now have Scotland's route map through and out of the crisis, and it gives us some clarity about what life will look like in the coming months. Understandably, a lot of the focus is on when schools will reopen and how formal education will be delivered safely. But the conversation is much wider than that. The right to education is about developing a child's unique personality, talents, and ability, and goes far beyond formal schooling to embrace a broad range of life experiences and learning processes. So today I want to discuss a rights-based education built on supportive relationships with strong participation and peer-to-peer support from other children and young people, because we know that that's the best way to develop children and fulfill their potential. But setting that within the context of the public health emergency that we're in. But setting it alongside that public health emergency, a recognition that we are now in an education and mental health emergency for children and young people, and we have to take a more robust response to that. Teachers, parents, and carers have been doing an amazing job over the last few months to support children's education. But school isn't just a place where children go to learn. It's a place where children socialize, eat, play, have fun. And for many children, school is a place of safety and where they can access support. Being away from school is a significant infringement of children's rights. Not having the state-supported education is an infringement of children's rights, and that needs to ensure that it's necessary and proportionate. And that's the discussion that we need to be having. We also need to recognize that the summer holidays have always been challenging for some children, with a loss of school-based support, such as breakfast clubs and school meals and after-school clubs. And so the pressure this year will be exponentially worse. And so as we move into the next phases of our response, we need to stay focused on the health and economic impacts, but we need to be much more focused on the social, educational, and mental health impacts of the pandemic on children. Not only do we need to make sure that provisions in place to support families over the summer, particularly for parents that are trying to return to work, but we need to use this period to set up systems that will ensure that we take a rights-based approach in future. Today I've been tasked with providing a human rights overview of the right to education in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic. People are writing books on this subject and are much smarter than I am, but for today's purpose, I'll try and give you a very brief outline with the time that we've got available, and then I very much look forward to the broader discussion we'll be having and hearing from the other speakers. Whenever I talk to children and young people about the human rights framework, I start with the UN Charter. Following the horrors of the beginning of the 20th century, the world came together to say we need to do things differently. And this is important because when we developed the human rights framework, we started with the UN Charter, which begins with the words, "We the peoples of the United Nations, determined to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war, which twice in our lifetime has brought untold suffering to humanity. But we agreed to reaffirm our faith in fundamental rights and dignity, and to commit all of the resources globally of governments to fulfillment of rights." And that's an important legal principle, that it's about state obligation to fulfill the rights of all of us, but particularly children and young people. And that human rights aren't something foreign or imposed upon us, but they're things that we have claimed through democratic process. And over the last 70 years, through democratic processes and international law, we've set out a broad array of important human rights obligations, but none is more important, to my mind, than the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. It was the first legally binding international piece of law that brought together all civil, political, economic, social, cultural rights, along with environmental rights and humanitarian law, into one place. And more important than that, it starts with the idea that every child in the world should grow up in a family environment of happiness, love, and understanding. An international legal document signed up to by all countries in the world, except one, that starts with an idea of happiness, love, and understanding, and builds a legal framework binding on states to deliver the things that ensure that children's lives can be fulfilling. The CRC has been widely ratified. It's the most widely ratified international treaty in the world. It was the fastest ratified. And it proclaims children's status as human beings with a distinct set of rights. This isn't about charity. This isn't about aspiration. This is about rights. And I'm pleased that the Scottish Government has reaffirmed its commitment to pass a domestic law in Scotland within the next 10 months to bring the UNCRC into our domestic law and make it enforceable at domestic law. And I think the pandemic has really shown the need for that. But importantly, the convention isn't just about holding states to account. It sets out a really clear framework for how government should fulfill its obligations, particularly on things like education. At the beginning of the pandemic, the Committee on the Rights of the Child at the United Nations warned of the significant impact on children and young people and set out 11 priority areas. And some of them are particularly important to our discussion today. To consider the health, social, educational, economic and recreational impacts on children. To explore alternative and creative solutions for children to enjoy their rights to rest, leisure, play and cultural and artistic activities. To ensure that online learning doesn't exacerbate existing inequalities. And that's been so important as we move to digital learning. The impact of those that are digitally excluded through poverty has been immense. But also to immediately activate measures to ensure that children are fed nutritious food and to protect children whose vulnerability might be further increased through the pandemic. And very importantly, to provide opportunities for children's views to be heard and taken into account in decision-making around the pandemic. And I think that's something that we all know very clearly hasn't been happening as well as it should. As well as the broader and obvious impacts on the right to education, we need to consider that the rights framework is interlinked and interdependent. And so not only does the closure of schools impact on education directly, but impacts on things like the right to adequate and nutritious food, the right to an adequate standard of living, the right to the highest attainable standard of mental health. And I think that's a very important discussion that needs to be had around the impacts of mental health on children, the right to be protected, but also the right to play, to associate, to seek and share information. And the impacts of the pandemic have not been equal. Those that were already poor, those disabled, socially vulnerable children have suffered a disproportionate impact from the pandemic and particularly from school closures. And so the obligation on the state is additional to those children and young people and their families. And this covers school-age children, but also importantly, early years. While the decision to close schools was of course justified on public health grounds, the need to ensure that restrictions are only imposed when necessary, when proportionate with the absolute minimum is something we need to constantly be addressing. I'm aware of time, but I'll briefly cover the right to education just for context. It's important that the right to education is seen not as an issue of charity or aspiration, it's a state duty to respect, protect and fulfill. And there's not just a right to access education, but education is also defined in terms of what the aims or purpose of education are. And it's set within the context and obligation on the state to use all available resources to the maximum extent possible. So education shouldn't be siloed. Education should be seen as an obligation on the whole of the state. So using all available resources to the maximum extent possible, not just to include access to education, but to deliver on the purposes of education. And so the right to education, which is set out in Article 28 of the Convention on the Rights of the Child, is broader than just schooling. And the UN Committee on the Rights of the Child has expanded on the obligation to pre-primary education, acknowledging the really important role of parents and families in those early years, but also obliging states to make sure they've got organized programs to support children from birth, recognizing the importance of that link to developing to the maximum extent. And the right to education is a really broadly defined one. UNESCO has an international standard classification of education, which defines it as a coherent set or a sequence of educational activities or communication designed and organised to achieve predetermined learning objectives or to accomplish a specific set of educational tasks over a sustained period. So educational activities, communication of information, organised and sustained. And I think that framework is useful in discussion, particularly around what's happening at the moment in terms of children's education and what the plans are for later in the year. So that it's activities, organised and sustained, and it's involving a communication, a dialogue, relationship-based. But also recognising that non-formal education is important as well, and that education encompasses the entirety of the process of social life. The first special rapporteur on the right to education framed the qualitative elements of education as that it needs to be available, accessible, acceptable, and adaptable. And those are fairly self-explanatory, but we can maybe talk about some of them later. But availability is something that I think is core to our discussions today. So it needs to be the sufficiency of budgetary resources. So this is teachers, but this is also IT and connection, and remembering that obligation to use all available resources to the maximum extent possible. And this is closely linked to the purpose of education. The Convention on the Rights of the Child is a beautifully drafted document. I know that I'm in probably a small minority as an international human rights lawyer to appreciate the beauty of legal drafting, and some of you may have very different ideas about beauty, but if you have a look at Article 29 of the Convention, I think it's incredibly beautifully drafted. It talks about the development of a child's personality, talents, mental and physical abilities to their fullest potential. And it goes on to talk about respect for human rights, a respect for your own identity, your culture and your traditions, a sense of self. Also talks about preparation for life in a free society. So understanding concepts of peace, tolerance, understanding and friendship amongst peoples, understanding other people, and respect for the natural environment. When I read through that, it really kind of gets me right in the heart that the whole world signed up to this common understanding of what the purpose of education was and linked it to an obligation on states to use all of their resources to fulfill that. And so that wider holistic view of education isn't just about what happens from teachers to students, it's also about peer-to-peer and relationships, and recognizing the really important sense of identity about the duty being on the state. I don't have time to expand. I know I'm very close to using up my time already, but the committee's first general comment, I think, is really important here and sets that out very clearly. So in relation to the pandemic, just to wrap up a wee bit, we have to see this as an education emergency as well as a public health emergency. We are a long way from being back to normal. And the impacts of these few months are going to be profound on children and young people. So even when we're able to get back to be providing in-school learning, but also all the community-based supports that go around that, there's still the impact of this time that we need to address. And so the decisions we make now are going to have really long-term impacts on children, because it's about play, socialization, safety. And I think that we need to keep in mind all of those things. The participation element of it, I think, is particularly important as well, because children and young people have the right to participation in all decisions that affect them. That's a legal right. And they've been very absent, I would say, in a lot of the decision-making so far. And the excuses being put forward by some decision makers that there wasn't time, or that children might not understand some of the decisions being made, aren't acceptable. And we need to do much better at involving children and young people, as well as parents and others, in this decision-making in a much better way, because we know that that's the way to make better decisions, and children are experts in their own lives. And we know that the more that they're involved in designing their own education, the better it will be for them and the better outcomes they will have. I'm now over time, so I'm going to just finish up, I think, there, just making one final point, I suppose, is that as we move forward and have these discussions about what comes next, we have to take a holistic view about children's rights. Of course, we need to protect the right to health, and of course, we need to base decisions on what the scientists and medical experts are telling us in order to protect public health. But the restrictions on children's rights, particularly the right to education, and recognizing the impact that's disproportionate on those affected by poverty or have additional support needs, disability, care experienced children and young people. We need to make sure that any continued restriction can be justified as necessary and proportionate, and only needs to be in place for the minimum time possible. And that decisions need to be made with children and young people's best interest at the heart of it, and children and young people's participation in the heart of it. Thank you.
Thank you, Bruce. Thanks very much. I'm now going to introduce to you Maureen McAteer from Barnardo's. Thank you, Maureen.
Hello everybody. It's absolutely lovely to be here. Thank you, Claire. Thanks for inviting me to be part of today. I'm absolutely delighted to be part of the conversation today about how we can explore together I suppose what Bruce was alluding to at the very end there, what needs to be in place as we move through this pipeline of phases, and thinking about the support for children and young people, and also for each other, because it's been such a challenging situation. So today I'm mostly going to talk about the film that we co-created with Public Health Scotland, and a bit about my experience supporting the education partnership work that we do across Scotland. But for anybody who's interested in the sort of wider Barnardo's response to COVID, we have been publishing a series of reports, one a week, on social media under the hashtag #InThisTogether, and they cover a range of themes, things like family support and domestic abuse, or 16+ services. We've done one on residential services, and this week is actually on children's rights and advocacy and the work that we've been doing around that, which again aligned with some of the themes that Bruce was talking about around how we involve children, young people and their families in decision making. So Claire is thankfully putting slides up, so you don't need to look at me. It's so funny doing these because you can't read the room. I really miss being in the room with people. I don't know whether they make me more or less nervous than when I'm normally speaking at things. Anyway, I suppose when I was thinking about the theme for today, about the power of positive relationships, I was thinking a lot about that phrase that people have been using about how we're all in the same storm but in very different boats. And in terms of the work we've been doing in Barnardo's, it really, really resonated with me, because although there's been a shared disruption to children attending physical school buildings together, I think undoubtedly the spectrum of different experiences of being at home, is really, really unbelievable in the last few months. Obviously some kids will have had the care and attention of one, a caregiver at home, while others will have parents who have been key workers and they'll be worried about that. They'll have parents who are maybe working. I know I've got a healthy dose of parental guilt about the lack of home learning that I've been overseeing with my kids. So it's been really, really tricky, and I think by the time kids return to school buildings later on in the year, they'll have spent literally months and months at home. They'll have had really massively reduced contact with their pals, with their wider family networks, as well as probably limited recreation in their wider community. And obviously some children will also have had the additional distress of bereavement through COVID or other situations, child poverty, which Bruce mentioned. I know that's been a massive bit of the work that we've been doing in Barnardo's, trying to mitigate against that, along with a lot of other third sector and local authority colleagues. There's been a real increase in instances of domestic abuse, and there's also been other forms of abuse that have been picked up through this period. And I think our sense is that many children and young people will have been left feeling really anxious, really isolated and really stressed. And as Bruce was saying, schools, community centres, libraries, youth clubs, all the other resources that are normally available to children and young people are so much more than just buildings. They're really safe, calm spaces where kids can go and they can be together, they can grow, they can learn, and they can develop, and they can hang out with each other. And I think that's it's been a real miss for a lot of people in the last few months. And I think for many of the children and young people that we support, the experience of suddenly just being without the security and the structure of school and the contact of potentially a range of trusted adults in their life will have had a profound impact. And I think the truth is, it's going to take a long time to rebuild and repair some of those disrupted relationships on the return. So I suppose I was thinking, we all face challenges. In Barnardo's, we're looking at how do we start to open up our services and increase our face-to-face contact again. We're very much in that place as well. But I think that there are especially challenges within the education context because of the numbers of children and young people that they have to support day in, day out. So it's really great actually today to get the chance to come together and think about what we in Barnardo's and in our film with Public Health Scotland talked about, the simple things that we can do, because it can feel a wee bit overwhelming. But just thinking about what are the simple things that we can do to strengthen our relationships and to help kids find safety, to help them find belonging, to help them find connection in our settings, wherever they are. Can you move to the next slide, please, Claire? So prior to the pandemic, alongside Public Health Scotland, Barnardo Scotland had developed a film called It's All About Relationships, embedding relational trauma-sensitive approaches in education settings. And the work on this began well over a year ago, and really it was largely in response to some of the really amazing, outstanding work that we were seeing in the schools where we work in partnership with education colleagues, and just the abundance of evidence of a really deepening understanding of the emotional needs of children and young people within those settings. And we really wanted to capture and celebrate that. So that's really mostly where it came from. But it was also a response to some feedback that we were getting about how confusing for some people some of the terminology was. So we wanted to develop something that could demystify some of the language that was being used. So the language like trauma-informed or relational practice, and say, what does that actually look like? What do we mean when we say that? And how it also connected to lots of existing work that was already happening. It's not something different or new. It's actually people are doing it already. They maybe just wouldn't attribute those terms to it. And also that it connects to rights, respect in school work, to compassionate and connected classrooms work, to the nurture principles that a lot of schools already work on, and sort of wider social and emotional learning that takes place in schools. And alongside this in Barnardo's, we'd also been calling for a national conversation about the health and wellbeing of education staff. And over the last year, we'd published a couple of reports exploring that whole issue about what could or should be in place for education professionals to sustain them, given that I suppose the high levels of emotional distress that children and young people that they are supporting may be coming in through the school gates with. So I think the situation we find ourselves in, it really only magnifies the need and for a conversation like this, and the importance of the core messages that we had in the film, which is about what are the simple things that each of us can do day in, day out, every time we interact with children and young people, to try and strengthen the relationships that we have with them. And of course, now it's never been more important. So as you can see, I've put the link, it's very faint, I apologise for that. I've put the link on this slide, and it's the link to the film and all the associated resources that are linked to that. So we have film notes that go alongside that, and we'll also have we'll have it broken down into chunks for you. So hopefully you'll find this useful, and you can use it in your networks to share and help facilitate conversations about what are the simple things that we can do to strengthen relational practice. Can I have the next slide, please, Claire? So in the film, we've chunked it into 4 chapters, which are highlighted on this slide. And I thought I would finish today by just really focusing on some of the practical things to think about around transitioning back, being into a physical school environment. And that is through, I mean, I can't claim the credit for any of this. Most of this has come from other people, from the service staff that I've spoken to about what their thoughts are around this. So firstly, building relationships. And it was really interesting, actually, my wee boy is in P7, so he was actually in school this week for the first time in months and months. He had a half day. And when he came home, I was asking him, what did you do today? What did you do when you were in seeing your friends? And he said that the teachers it was really quite light touch from the teachers. They'd mostly been allowed to just sit and chat with others in their class. And I had just thought how lovely that was, to give the children the space to reconnect with those friendships that have been really disrupted over the last few months. So I think creating those sorts of spaces is really, really important. And I know our staff have said offering opportunities for children and young people to rebuild their friendships is really important. For some kids, friendships are a tricky thing day in, day out at school, so there will be a lot of anxiety about going back to school and how that transition into those relationships again is going to feel. So I think any supportive adults helping with that could be really, really valuable. And also the staff talked about having a very gradual introduction of other additional supports, because it could be a bit overwhelming for children and young people. There's been a lot of a big step back by the range of providers of services that children usually interact with, and to kind of go back whole hog into that might feel a bit too much. So just doing that in quite a managed way would be really, really helpful. In addition to that, we also talked about how important it was to create a space for children and young people to talk about their experience of coronavirus specifically, and help them. Just by talking about it, it might help them to understand and express their feelings, both about themselves but about what they've observed and the other people around them. So helping them make sense of that. And we recognise that that's not a once activity, that will need to be revisited, because it's been such a significant, and it will have had such a significant impact on them. And Bruce mentioned about some of the milestones that kids have missed. So I know that some of our staff were saying, it'd be really lovely if we could attempt, there's been missed proms, missed end of year things, lots of transition activities, but there'll be other things, and it's if and when it's safe to do so, it would be really lovely to try and make sure that kids don't completely miss out on those things, and that we can maybe try and recreate the conditions that they can happen in. The second chapter is about reframing and modelling behaviour. Education staff who participated in the film talked about not assuming that children come into school with the skills that they may need to develop and sustain and deepen relationships. Therefore, the supportive adults around need to be able to model these skills, and talked about how important that was to be able to do that. So on return to education settings, our staff have talked about just how helpful it will be to slow down some of the communication and ensure that all children and young people have a clear understanding about what will happen when they return to school. And we think that on its own would actually address an awful lot of the worries and concerns that kids have, because things will be different, it will look different, it will feel different, there'll be less people, so they really need to be prepared in advance for that. People who work with children and young people, and as Bruce has talked about already, we know loads of kids will have faced significant adversity over this period, and their difficulty in settling back into school may be more a reflection of that difficulty than a response to what's actually happening in the school environment. And we know from the work that we do and the work we do in partnership with others that affecting change in respect of all of this can take time. And I suppose what I wanted to sort of highlight is maybe they need to be a bit gentle with ourselves about, it will take time for things to kind of go back to any kind of sense of stability or normality. So be kind to ourselves and to each other, and to the children and young people that we work with. I think that we've collectively been through an awful lot together, and we just need to take account of that and how we adjust as we go back. The third chapter is about creating a safe environment and a positive culture, and there's examples in the film which talk about timeout cards and safe breakout spaces and worry monsters, and I think these all give children and young people and the staff who support them options that can be used where things start to escalate and people need a bit of a safe space to manage difficult feelings and emotions. And I think that the need for these and other strategies will probably have increased and potentially even may need to be extended to others in the school on return to school buildings later in the year. And while these approaches are really effective and we've had great feedback about them, I think it's also really important to ensure that children and young people have access to safe adults in school, and there's somewhere they know they can go if they need that time to be with somebody and to get that one-to-one attention around some of this stuff. I know there's a range of people on this webinar today. It's not just people from the education sector, there's people from youth work and other children's organisations. And many schools have connections with organisations like yours in their community. And I think that what I would just hope that people leave with today is that education colleagues are not in this on their own, that we are absolutely, as organisations who support children and young people, really keen to work in partnership with schools to give them the help they need over this really tricky period. And there's a lot of people who are around who can provide support, not just in school, but also to children and young people and their families in the community. So we really want to have those opportunities to work together and to support each other with this, because it's navigating these challenges is not straightforward. And finally, I wanted to talk about the final theme, which is supporting staff health and wellbeing. So in the film, Keith, the head teacher from Falkirk High, highlights in the film that teaching, or indeed work across any sector where you have a lot of contact with children and young people, takes great personal resilience. And let's be honest, it can be a really tough job at times. So some of the teachers and head teachers in the film share examples of what a sort of effective way of supporting staff could look like. And I think the thing that I've been really thinking about, and I'm thinking about this in terms of my own, the people I'm interacting with in my own organisation, some people have really been through a tough time, so there'll be people who are going back to physically being face-to-face contact who may have faced significant adversity themselves through this period. And that's just the nature of this COVID crisis. It's really impacted huge swathes of people. And I know in Barnardo's we've really had to up our game in terms of support for staff around health and wellbeing, because the strain of this situation can just leave people feeling really depleted, really tired, exhausted, feeling a bit low, missing out on all the social connections and supports that you have via your workplace. And schools will be no different. So the film mentions the phrase, "you can't pour from an empty cup," which I'm sure is familiar to lots of people. But I suppose what we really think is that making staff health and wellbeing a top priority is a really important way of valuing our workforce, and also ensuring that children and young people get the best possible care available to them. We've started to look at our service spaces, and we have an Edinburgh hub where we're providing some bespoke supports to some children with additional support for learning needs. And I had a lovely conversation with the children's service manager there, and in preparation for welcoming children into our space, she had individually met with all the staff, some of whom were understandably very, very anxious about being back and having to work face to face. And what she was saying to them, reassuring them and showing them all the measures that were being put in place to maintain their safety and the safety of the children, was, these kids, some of them have had a really tough time and they need you to be safe and calm. And if you're feeling really anxious, that's not fair on the kids. They need to come in and have a space that's different from what they've been living for the last few months at home. And I think that that's just a really interesting way of putting it. It's like we have to, somebody in the film talks about that as well, I need to be there calm. And I think that that's a really important thing to hold on to. But in order to do that, people need to be appropriately supported, because you can't engage with all the difficulties that children and young people may be bringing to our door without being impacted by it. So I think we need to have a very thoughtful response to that and put significant measures in place to ensure the health and wellbeing of staff. So I don't know where I am time-wise, but I've kind of come to the end anyway. So thank you very, very much. It's been, as I say, lovely to be here, and I'm looking forward to the questions that are going to be coming later on.
Thank you, Maureen. That was very interesting. Thanks very much. And finally, on to our final speaker for the day is Eileen Pryor, Executive Director of Connect, formerly the Scottish Parent Teacher Council. Thank you, Eileen.
Hi, folks. Really happy to be here this afternoon, virtually. And yeah, Connect, formerly Scottish Parent Teacher Council, works with parents and parent groups.
Sorry, Eileen, can I interrupt you just to say, can you put on your video?
All right, okay.
There you go, that's you.
I was hoping to get away with that, Claire. Okay, yeah, so Connect is a charity, a parents group, which has been on the go for very many years, and supporting parents and parent groups around the whole business of engaging with children's learning and education. Claire, can you stick my slides on for me, please? If that doesn't happen, I'll just wing it.
Bear with me a wee minute, Eileen.
No, listen, if this isn't going to happen, Claire, I'll just bash on.
If you want to just keep going, I'll see what's going on, but yeah, carry on just now, thanks.
Okay, so yeah, we've been working with parents and parent groups for more than 70 years, and you know, during that time have increasingly focused on the power of the relationship between home, school and community as being the key one to support young people. We take the perspective that effective learning for young people is not achieved in isolation by schools or by teachers. It's actually achieved by that mutual support that comes from all of the adults and supports around a young person. So families have a key role in supporting the learning and in supporting the school. So our focus since COVID-19 kicked off in Scottish schools has been around supporting parents and families around home learning. And it's interesting because, of course, a lot of people have been talking about home education and homeschooling. And our perspective on that is that homeschooling is a choice that actually a relatively small number of families make. Home education is something that you have got to be equipped for and ready to do. And families in Scotland, for the most part, were not equipped or ready to do that when schools closed suddenly in March. And so actually what parents are doing in relation to their children is trying to support their home learning and trying to support the schoolwork, which is coming in different ways, in different formats, to a greater or lesser extent to their various children. So we're kind of really clear that this is not home education, because parents, generally speaking, are not teachers, and we can't expect them to be. So we've been working on really ensuring that parents' voices are heard in all of this time. Claire, if you could move me on, please. So our message to parents over the last almost 3 months now has been really, your job is the job that you have every other day of the year as a parent. It's to keep your children safe, healthy and happy. You know, that's the key function of parents, and particularly as we're caught up in this pandemic, you know, forget all the other stuff that you're under pressure to do as much as you can. Focus on your children and keeping them well and happy as much as you can in extraordinarily difficult circumstances. We've also been saying you are good enough. You know, what families do at home day in, day out, year in, year out, which is home learning, is actually the bedrock of children's learning. It's the stuff that parents do without even thinking. It's the daft games that you play with your kids. It's the board games, the baking, the cooking, the gardening, all of the things which ideally you're able to do with your children. And that provides the foundation of what schools then build on. So families, don't try and be teachers, don't try and homeschool, actually focus on what you can do and what you and your children love to do. And I know I'm talking about the ideal here, and probably like you, my social media feed has been filled with these happy, smiley families with the, you know, the lovely big gardens and the playrooms and all the resources. And we all know that, yes, there's a certain segment of society where that is the case, but the reality for very many families is a 2-bedroom flat in a multi-storey, no outdoor space, very little prospect of getting out. And so for those families, we have to recognise that actually this has been an extraordinarily difficult period. So I'm kind of repeating myself here. Few parents are teachers, and you can't be expected to be one. So supporting schoolwork is perhaps what you can do. But if you can't do that, then don't sweat it. And of course, the reality is some families have really struggled to even support schoolwork. We've been surveying our parent contacts. We're in our second survey at the moment, our lockdown survey, to try and find out how they're doing, how they're feeling, you know, the variation is enormous. Some parents are saying, yeah, we're quite content, we're doing okay, we're getting schoolwork done, and we're having a bit of fun as well. But some families are absolutely at the end of their tether. They perhaps have 2 or 3 youngsters, but 1 laptop and 1 phone. Perhaps the information is coming from school on different platforms which they and sometimes their children are unfamiliar with. Perhaps they just don't have broadband. Perhaps they have their own health issues, and perhaps have 2 or 3 kids in the house who are all doing different things. So for many families, you know, even maintaining the schoolwork has been a real issue on lots and lots of different levels. If we can move on, Claire. So our messages to policymakers have really echoed those messages to parents about the job of parents. You know, parents aren't substitute teachers. They are there. Their primary role is around the health and happiness and safety of their children. And we keep saying there's a pandemic on, you know, and we all know it on one level, but we also, very many of us are trying to do our jobs, and folk around local authorities and schools are no exception to that. We're trying to get a job done. But I think if we're not careful, we forget the stress and strain and the impact on families of the pandemic. And the fact that the families that local authorities know about as being vulnerable, if we will use that language, actually there's a whole lot of other families out there now who could be classed as vulnerable, whose lives have been turned upside down by this pandemic, who have found the youngster perhaps who has additional support needs whose behaviour and practice, resistance to learning has become a massive issue. Perhaps there are others in the family who are also ill, whose services have been withdrawn, and so people find themselves in a sandwich which really makes it impossible for them to really support anyone very well. And in fact, we've heard endlessly from parents who are trying to support their children's schoolwork, trying to work themselves, and trying to just keep their family going. And those stresses and strains have been enormous. So the disruption to learning certainly has been an issue, but the disruption to children's and families' lives goes way beyond that, and the everyday stresses of living in lockdown and under this pandemic, I think we underestimate it at our peril. And we're also saying to policymakers that many families need support and help, not just those who are known to services. We know from the feedback that we've had from families that there are a lot more people out there who need help and don't know how to navigate the system because they've never had to before. And so the landscape is changing. If we can move on, Claire. So, as I mentioned, we've been surveying parents. We're in the almost halfway point of our second survey, and I say there we've had 5,500 responses checked yesterday, and we're just under 6,000 responses. So we're hearing from a lot of parents around the country. It has to be said there are some parts of Scotland where there is particular anxiety around not just lockdown, but around the return to school, and that we've seen spikes in certain areas from parents, as you will probably expect. So parents have been sharing their experiences of their family, good and bad, around home learning, what's worked, what hasn't worked. And they've been expressing their anxieties about the impact on their children. And you might be interested to know that actually the bulk of those concerns are around the health and well-being of their children and their relationships with their pals, but also the fact that they're missing the relationship that they have with school staff, with teachers. They're missing the contact that they usually have with their teachers. And some of them are feeling quite bereft. So parents are really worried about these things, worried about how this is going to work when youngsters go back to school. And yes, the learning, the education has been part of that, but in fact, a lot of it has been about the relationships that the young people and children have with each other, and the impact that it's had on the relationships within the family unit, because we've all been stressed, we've all been strained, some more than others. And actually trying to be a child's teacher is a different relationship to being a child's parent. And so, the parents are concerned about how their relationship with their child has changed during this time, and how it will continue to be different as we start to go back to school, however that happens over from August onwards. I think we'll maybe not get into that one. And if we can move on, Claire. So in terms of some of the feedback, these are just some kind of top level figures. 28% of parents feel positively about a return to school, but 65% see negative impacts on children's relationships, on mental health, their own mental health, and on their child's education. And one of the key things for us is how do we negotiate the relationships between home and school, as we start to move back towards starting school and nursery again, and how can those relationships really support the child and the family unit. I would say that you know, we will be in a situation where we will actually have to be looking at the family unit to support their recovery from what has been and will continue to be a really difficult situation. If we can move on, please. So from our perspective, because you know, our work is all about supporting the relationships between home and school community. And from our perspective, what's happened over the last 3 months has really thrown into sharp contrast the different practices and relationships between schools, local authorities and parents. And I think in shorthand that says, if they've been doing quite well up until now, they probably continue to do quite well, and the positive communication and relationship has thrived. But where that has not existed, and where there have been fractures in that relationship, or it's been downright poor, actually, that has really shown up in over the last few months. And the impact and proposed return model is going to have significant and long-term impact on children and families. And I know I'm repeating myself, but I think we underestimate that at our peril. Or we can invest and can make a more creative curricular model and focus on strong, mutually supportive relationships among families, education and community. I've personally been really disappointed at the lack of creativity that's been shown in the design of the return model. We've focused on getting back to the classroom and not actually on getting back to learning. And the sense that children only learn in the classroom, which is of course nonsense. So, you know, we have to have a more creative approach. And for families, we need to have an approach that also ensures that their children are being looked after well. And that doesn't necessarily happen at home, nor does it have to happen at home. We actually have to provide children with a broad range of experiences. The creative juices have to flow. We have to get them outside, using different spaces and working with different groups of people to really support them over the coming months and years as we start to pull ourselves out of the impact of COVID. So thank you very much. I'll finish there, and I'm imagining there'll be a few questions.
Thanks, Eileen, that was great. Thank you very much. I'm just going to, so we're actually now going to do a quick poll just to get some of your own feedback. So I'm just going to post that up. Bear with me a second while I get this up. And if you could just answer the questions, and as I said earlier, this remains anonymous, so please feel free to be as honest as you like. Thank you. And if you could just scroll down and make sure you answer, there's 4 questions in total. Okay, I'm just going to give another 10 seconds or so, and then we'll get on with some questions. Okay, I'm going to end that now. Thanks very much for everyone that responded to that. Okay, so I'm now going to open up the, I'll put the results there. I'm actually, whilst I'm opening up the other speakers to join the Q&A, you can all have a look at the results. We have. Okay. Right, I shall just, it's quite interesting, we can have a look at that. We'll look at all these results later on, but I'd like to get on with some of the questions and discussion now. The first one that I have up, I'm going to ask each of you the question, but first of all to Bruce. How can we find a balance between parents' desire for a return to normal schooling hours to accommodate work and home pressures with what children's emotional and education needs are? And how can we communicate this to parents, particularly using the UNCRC?
I think this question cuts right to the heart of the decisions that we need to be making at the moment, this really difficult balance of rights in terms of ensuring that children are able to access their full right to education, but also that we balance the public health needs. And we do have to follow the scientific advice in terms of public health. There's a clear right to life issue and right to health issue around that. So we need to make sure that we accept that, but the measures that we put in place take into account all of the rights concerns that we have in relation to children, particularly around mental health and preparedness for learning, particularly around things like socialization. I know that in the chat there's been talk about particularly younger children's and how physicality and play is so much part of their learning and development, and so that has to be thought about. And also the educational attainment as well. And so balancing that is difficult. In terms of communication with, and it has to be led by the science, but what we need to do is involve children and young people more in the discussion, parents more in discussion, and look at education as broader than just what's happening in the schools. So if we can't have children right back in schools now with limited restrictions, then what else does the state need to be put in place to support that? And so making sure that we supplement that with as much as we can. But I think in terms of the communication to the parents is a really important point as well, because we've seen a very high level of compliance so far in terms of the restrictions on our lives. And the reason that the experts are telling us that there is such a high level of compliance, or has been previously, is because people really understood that connection, that this was necessary and proportionate, that if we didn't comply with the restrictions, then people were dying and people were being hurt. I'm sensing that's starting to change now a bit, and that there's some really legitimate questions being asked about the proposals being put forward as to whether they are still necessary and proportionate. And so there's a really important public communication message here, and parents, teachers, carers, wider community, but also children and young people need to be really part of that discussion. We need to understand why the restrictions are so important, and we need to be convinced that they are necessary, proportionate, and limited. And also we need to know from government, local authorities, what else they're going to put in place to support us. And again, a lot of issues around poverty and digital access. This needs to be seen as an educational crisis, and there needs to be significant resources wrapped around children and families to really support that right to education, as well as a strong kind of communication around why it's necessary. And again, all of those wider focuses on play, on child protection, but really on, as I think the chat's been really clear on relationships and how important those are, whether those are with trusted adults and professionals, but also with peers as well.
Thanks, Bruce. Eileen, you get anything you'd like to add to that?
No, I think that pretty well covered
Bruce
it.
is pretty much great.
Yeah.
Maureen?
I think what I would like to say, we've been chatting to the parents that we support. So in order to engage with Barnardo's, there tends to be a need that's not met through universal services. So through this period, we've been chatting to them about what their experience of home learning has been. And given that that's going to continue, hope there is going to be some component of home learning for the foreseeable future. What's been really interesting is, although I absolutely digital poverty is a massive issue. A lot of parents have said they would really like sort of physical learning packs, that they prefer that. There's also been feedback about, I suppose, the more bespoke, so anything that's like bespoke to their child or individual contact, so things like, you know, people have talked about a teacher writing an individualised letter to a child, or, you know, to encourage them to engage. Or I know that there's been different, some people have done lessons, I know the teaching on YouTube channels, because most people can get that on their telly, where there's been phone calls made to a child's home, and that engagement relationally. I think all of those things seem to have been really appreciated and resulted in a much more effective engagement. And I think that what, in the enormous challenge of trying to get this right, somehow the system starts to focus on, you know, the needs of the education system rather than keeping the needs of children and young people right at the heart. And I think that that's been really challenging. And I suppose I've got I don't have any answers, but I've got more questions, because I do wonder whether there are some specific groups of children and young people who need something different to what's been proposed, because my understanding is the proposals that are being made at the moment are about all children. And I think there's some specific groups of children and young people who might need something additional and different. Not everybody is in the same as we started, where I started from, but in the same sort of in different boats, and maybe there needs to be greater account taken of that in the planning for the foreseeable.
Can I just be clear? You know, I would entirely agree, and I think I said this, I do feel like a stuck record at the moment, that we've been desperately trying to go back to school instead of going back to learning. Do you know? And so the focus on school as the only place where learning happens has taken us to where we are now, that actually quite often parents have not been consulted, although they want to be consulted, they want to be asked their views, they've not been. So they're not able to express their fears and concerns for their children, or their fears and concerns for their family. And the opportunities that this gives us, whether it be for more effective digital learning, combined with a more creative approach to learning out with school, that seems to have been just totally disregarded. I've not heard any whispers even about that more creative approach being taken. So it's really disappointing that we've kind of failed to do that. And as you say, it's been more about the establishment than about the children and the families.
Mm-hmm. Well, that leads on quite well to the next one, which I know, Bruce, you covered in your presentation, was do you think that the pandemic has highlighted that children and young people should be included in decision making in schools, so that there's a pupil, teacher, parent, council joined up approach? I think I know your answer to this, but
absolutely. And again, one of the lovely things about this this platform is I can see all the chats. And so hi to Ryan, who asked that question, who's done some amazing work on poverty and on the voice of care experience, children and young people, and has played an important role as a human rights defender. And I think that, and I see a lot of other people in the audience as well, who are friends and heroes of mine. I think this is absolutely, as you say, Claire, my answer is fairly obvious on this. It absolutely has demonstrated that this pandemic has really demonstrated the need to take a rights-based approach, including the participation of children and young people. And I think that's why the incorporation of the Convention on the Rights of the Child still being on its current timetable of being passed within the next 10 months is really essential, because I think we need to use this opportunity to really change culture. And so we're going to have a legal mechanism to help do that. But also the public attention and the way that it's impacted on so many more people's lives at the moment, it's a really good time to be thinking about how we are being described as kind of build back better kind of stuff. How do we change the way that we make decisions? How do we focus that more on the individual needs of children and build in flexibility to the system, and make sure we take a relationships-based approach to children and young people and their learning, and that broader holistic approach that Eileen had been talking about, and Maureen was talking about in terms of particularly supporting younger children as well.
Yeah. Eileen, would you like to add anything to that?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's our approach as an organisation is that this this whole business of educating our children, building their capacities, supporting them as they develop as adults, is not just the job of schools. It's not just the job of parents. It's actually a combined role which can only function if we have strong relationships and if young people are engaged in those conversations. So yeah, I mean, to me, to us, it's blindingly obvious. And as I say, you know, we've seen that those schools that we've been working with who have strong relationships with families, actually the way in which they have managed this crisis over the last few months has benefited from the way that they work. And the ones where they struggle to create relationships, where there is a hierarchical approach, they've really struggled to engage families. And so, you know, as I say, it just feels a bit of a duh kind of moment.
Yeah. And I'll go to you as well, Maureen, please.
I suppose, I mean, I think some of that's already been attended to, but just specifically to pick up on the whole issue of parents, because I currently there is conversations going on about what a more robust, coherent strategy across Scotland to supporting families looks like. And to me, it's like that really does need to be joined up with the work of the Education Recovery Group and, you know, the associated stakeholders, because to me it's the same thing, and it's that linkage between the child within a family, within a community, which also links to the school community, and really pulling, to be honest, I feel a bit of a one-trick pony as well, but to me it is about really what GIRFEC was all about, the ambitions of GIRFEC, and if we can align what we're all doing back to that overarching principle, I think that it can really strengthen, you know, and it's complex and we've got finite resources and we've got enormous needs, but I think that it's a way of helping to make the whole thing feel a bit more coherent for everybody within that system, so that they understand the overarching principles and what it is we're ultimately trying to achieve.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay, and thanks for answering these. I will move on. We've got quite a few here. So how do we support and include those children for whom school isn't a safe, fun, engaging place, and who have actually found being at home to be a positive social, emotional and learning experience? Who would like to just, I think that again could go to either one of you. So Bruce, do you want to go first on that one?
Yeah, very happy to. We know that even before the pandemic, school wasn't working for some children and young people. And I think that the really important thing is that we need to make sure that the right to education is fulfilled. And we need to have really clear working with children and young people themselves, but also their families, to come up with the best model of that child fulfilling their potential, and remembering that the right to education goes to the purpose of education, which is about children thriving and developing to their full potential. And so the state's obligation is to put in place the best package of support around that. And I think that one of the worrying things is the lack across Scotland of coordinated support plans and plans that are put in place around what each child needs and how best to deliver their education. That was an issue before the pandemic. I think the pandemic has probably shone a really, really direct light on that. And so making sure that we recognise it's the state obligation to find out what's going to best deliver that child's education. And if school isn't working, then we need to figure out why and put in place supports for schools and teachers, or find other ways of delivering that education, always remembering what the purpose of education is, and recognising that the right is to education, not to schooling. That school is a really good way of delivering education for many, many children, but the right is to education. It's developing the individual, and so the plan needs to be based on that individual child, developed with the people that know them best, who are the parents and the family and the child and young person themselves. And we're not doing well enough on that. We weren't doing well enough before. Maybe this is an opportunity to really focus on providing that individualised support and planning.
And of course, a lot of these children will have additional support needs, disabilities, which will create that environment for them that being at home is a far more positive place for them to be. Eileen?
I mean, I would say that the other message that's come to us from the parents that we've spoken to is quite a number of them are really thinking very hard about their lives too, because they've really enjoyed having time with their children. being able to have proper quality time, to use that awful phrase, and not to have that, you know, rush out the door at 7:30 in the morning and not back till 7 or 8 o'clock at night, and cramming in the odd half hour with a child or a young person. So many parents are saying, is this really what I want my life to be, or what I want my relationship with my child to be? So I think there's a lot of re-evaluation going on, unfortunately, generally not within the education system. Very sad, isn't it? You know, the rest of us have taken the opportunity to think about what we're doing and how we're living our lives, but it feels like the education system has just been on a one track.
Yeah, absolutely. And Maureen, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's enormous pressures, isn't there, on schools to get back to, and to, I'm not sure where it comes from, but obviously the attainment agenda and reducing that attainment gap as the dominant narrative in education has created an energy around this. And I think what has been different, and from my perspective and the conversations that we've been having, is so many people at all levels of education talking about the importance of health and well-being. And when the Scottish Attainment Challenge kicked off, it felt to me like it was a third wheel, that numeracy and literacy were very much, you know, the focus. But I think that I mean, and that has shifted over time, and there's been lots of work in the lead up to this. But I think that this event in itself has really massively shifted that, and lots of people that I'm speaking to are saying that has to be the focus when we go back. And I know some people are saying it should be the sole focus when we go back. I don't know how open or welcome that is as a suggestion, but I do think there is a recognition across the education estate. I'm sure, I mean, some of the staff I'm speaking to, you know, they're really panicked about what they're being asked to do, and being able to do it in a way that doesn't further harm kids. And that somebody in the chat box who talked about that, it's like, you know, we can't sacrifice quality just to get the show back on the road. So I think that for me anyway, that's been a really hopeful part of this, that whole, you know, really putting health and wellbeing front and centre for schools.
Yeah, and actually one of the notice from the chat box, a secondary teacher is very concerned about the limitations that social distancing will place on effectively dealing with distressed behaviour. Do you all agree with that? And I mean, obviously, again, it's something scientifically that has been asked of all the schools, and we have to do that, and it's set, but it is going to make it an even bigger challenge returning to school, regardless of the numbers that are returning.
And I think I was walking my wee boy up to school for his first day back on Monday, and I said to him, "What are you thinking?" And he was like, "Oh, it's going to be like rules. They're going to be going on about the rules all day." And I think that is actually, I thought it probably are, you know, because it's different rules from the normal rules. Some children can manage that better than others, and that is going to be enormously challenging for some of our children who struggle to regulate in a school environment anyway. So I think that a thought does need to be given to that. And I know in our service spaces where we have started face-to-face work again, we're having all the same challenges about how do we do this safely, and where we work with young children or children with disabilities. You know, you can't maintain social distancing, that's the truth. So you have to then design the services in a way that, you know, really try to reduce the risks to staff and to those children. But you can't, you know, they're seeking that connection, and you can't do them.
That's it. Yeah. Eileen?
Yeah, I would just say that also parents and children are going to experience, just kind of building on what I was talking about earlier, as children start going back, however they go back, I think there is going to be an issue around separation for both children and parents. Actually, you know, there's going to be a period when parents are going to feel quite bereft, and children will also feel bereft, not having the contact with their immediate family. I know that we're all climbing the walls on one level, but on the other level, isn't it? It's really nice. So, you know, we've got to understand that, and the special relationship that families have, and that sort of starting to split them up and have kids back into organised education again is going to be quite a challenge for a lot of people.
Yeah. And someone's actually just said in the chat box there that their son has been told that he won't have a support for learning worker due to social distancing, and that if he is distressed, the staff will come to his aid wearing PPE. I feel this is a barrier right away, and I think that absolutely is. If you're distressed and then someone comes in full-on gear that you're not used to, because we don't do that at home, it's just going to cause more stress.
Yeah, we've had a parent telling us that they've been told not to send their disabled son back to school for his own well-being, because he'll find it so hard. And you think, well, yeah, you know, actually he has a right to be in education, and to kind of turn it back to parents that you're actually going to damage your child's health and well-being by sending them to school.
I suppose the question is, what are we doing for those parents? So if those parents are happy to have their child at home, but they need some support to do that, it's what are we putting in place? Because I think that parents are such an enormous asset that are massively underused, and I can't remember kids spend 85% of their time at home or whatever, and in the rush to get everybody back into a school building, we're sort of forgetting about that enormous asset and you know, how I think what's been really amazing is when you see the resilience of parents through a really, really, really difficult time, and how they've totally stepped up to the plate and really managed very challenging situations, as you described beautifully, Eileen, about, you know, and housing that's not great, with multiple kids, with not enough devices and all of that. I mean, I've just been blown away by what parents have endured and how successfully they've done it, and I think they're deserving of our support and attention too.
Absolutely.
And I think that that's really important in terms of framing this as a rights issue. So the obligation on the state to support families and recognise all of this, and also to support teachers. I think that's a really important element in this as well, and early years practitioners. There's that the government needs to be doing much better in terms of providing really clear guidance about what support's going to be provided, and looking at the individual needs of individual children, and then what support can be brought in to support that process. Because I think someone's just said it in the comments that this transition is going to be difficult for all children, but it's going to be particularly difficult for some children and some families. And so our human rights response to that is to engage with those children and families and put in place the supports around them. But we don't want to end up in a situation, which I'm worried about, where we're putting all of the pressure onto teachers to try and enforce guidance which isn't appropriate without the resources. And I think particularly when you're talking about children with complex support needs and communication needs, but also very young children as well. And so when we're talking about early years, or we're talking about kind of early primary school, so much of their learning and engagement, and also so much of their communication is physical, and it's going to be impossible to maintain the type of physical distancing that the science says is necessary for public health. But government has to take that responsibility to set out in guidance that we accept that it's not going to be possible, rather than telling people, teachers and early years practitioners, to do one thing when they know that that's not going to be possible. So the obligation needs to be on the state to really clearly set out the framework for what's going on, and the risk needs to be held there, rather than putting parents and teachers and early years practitioners in this impossible position where, as others have said, that they're feeling conflicted because they haven't been given the support. And so we need to really focus our attention on the obligation of the state to provide support. So no parent or teacher should feel that they're breaking the rules, or they're doing something that's not in the best interest of a child because there's not enough support in place. And I think it really does come back to, again, it's been said in the chat and other places, that this is a crisis, and we need to have a full kind of system approach to it. We need to bring in additional resources. This isn't something that's just about the education or earlier system. This is something where we have to mobilize all of the resources available to the state to put in place significant additional resource. And I'm worried that we're not seeing that happening as yet. We took a public health approach and collective approach to addressing the public health element of this. We need to take a collective approach and collective responsibility, or government needs to mobilize its resources across government to address the education support needs, and all the knock-on mental health support, all of the other issues, poverty. I see people have been talking about the disproportionate impact on rural communities and others. I think that the chat function's been great here, and I hope we can collect that as well and come back to people in further discussion too.
Yeah, absolutely, because that actually addresses another point about early years, but you've answered that. One of the other questions from Lauren Jones from Colley Dean Community Centre: what role can the voluntary sector play in supporting children and young people through the education crisis? Are there key support services they should be focusing limited resources on? Can I address that? Who would like to take that question?
Eileen, I think I will.
Eileen, okay, thank you.
I think undoubtedly third sector can provide a massive amount of support, and I think I said earlier, you know, I'm just really disappointed that we've seen no sign of local authorities really embracing those opportunities, whether it be outdoor education, outdoor activities, which, you know, given we're in a pandemic, actually we know that that's going to be safer for children to be outdoors. Why are we not building that in initially, at least, and then give them lots of waterproofs and send them out in the winter as well, frankly. You know, we really do need to look at what resource we have within communities, arts-based projects. You know, there's so much, and so many of them, I suspect at the moment, are struggling and worrying about their future. So, you know, we need some investment to really engage that wider group of third sector organisations who are already geared up to supporting young people. So, you know, absolutely agree with that.
Okay, so we're nearing past, but if you're happy to take another question, it's on a slightly different. Would you be happy to take another question? Yeah. So there's so much pressure on young people to succeed in exams, and so much education time has been lost already. So should we try to shift emphasis to a more long-term learning approach? And slightly, well, no, I'll ask that one first.
I can answer this as a parent, not as certainly not representing Barnardo's here, but it just seems like that would be really sensible to do at this point. It's given the challenges that have been around that idea of a kind of one moment in time situation where you get your exams. It seems intuitively it makes sense to move to a more assessment-based situation so that you're building up that portfolio of work over a period of time. And I think it would also, for a lot of children, just take a lot of pressure off, because I know that a lot of the work we do in schools, the build up to exams creates so much anxiety in young people, which could be avoidable if we actually just change the way we operate our system.
Yeah, I agree as a parent.
And you know, I think that we're kind of stuck in a groove of the way that we do education in the UK, and we're not alone, but we'll talk about the UK. It's a system designed for universities. It's a system that's been designed to push people through and into the university system. And we know that actually that's not a reality for very many young people, nor should it be the reality for a whole lot of young people. You know, my kids are older now, but I know lots of graduates who've ended up doing jobs that did not require a university degree. You know, we actually have to get real about the opportunities that are there in our economy. I'm not doing down university, but I'm just saying our school system should not be designed to push people into university. If you look at Germany, for instance, their system is entirely different, and it's focused on trades and crafts, and yes, you can go to university, but actually what we want is a workforce who have skills, who are then able to use those skills to earn a living, because let's face it, that's what we all want to be able to do. So yeah, I think that the focus on exams, on qualifications is misguided, but a lot of parents have been through that system and buy it, you know, that because that's all they've ever known, you know. So I know a lot of schools tell us, you know, but no, we couldn't possibly change that because parents will be, you know, distressed about that. And my view on that as well, until you have the conversation about the alternatives, then yes, of course, because they've been fed that line for very many years, you know. So we're not going to change it overnight, but I certainly do believe that that's the case.
Thank you.
And I think you're both really ably explained what the purpose of education is, in terms of, if we look to the way in which the UN Convention was drafted, as I was saying at the beginning, the purpose of education isn't about passing exams. It's not even about attainment in terms of core subjects. It's about developing the personality and talent of the child in a way that makes them thrive and is able to kind of fit in the community and be productive. And of course, all parents want the best for their children, and what they want their best for the children's education. But I think I've been concerned for a long time about our narrowing focus on what attainment is and what we're measuring in relation to children's education. And we need to go back to those really core principles that the whole world signed up to. I mean, one of the things about Article 29, it starts by saying states agree. This is one of the few times in kind of international law where the states agreed this. We all agreed that the purpose of education wasn't about passing exams. It was about developing the child in all aspects of their mental, physical, all of their talents, because we knew that is what leads to the best society and understanding each other in relationships. And I think that is absolutely essential, that we reframe our education and use this opportunity to be reframing our education around a rights-based approach, which puts the child at the center of it and what they need, and move away from those measurements that are solely focused just on passing exams or purely and narrowly defined academic attainment, because it's not actually what's best for society. It's not actually what business is asking for. Whereas a rights-based education that develops the child to their full potential in the context of understanding relationships, understanding their own identity, and understanding and being able to engage with others, creates a society that we all want to live in.
Yeah, that's great. Well, I think that's pretty much a perfect place to bring this to a close. I'd like to thank each one of you for coming. I think it's been a really, really interesting afternoon, and I hope everybody who's attended agrees. Certainly by the look of the chat box, everybody seems to have got quite a lot out of this, which is great, and thanking you for your honest answers. So thank you very much. If you have any question that wasn't answered, or you have any additional questions, if I could ask you to email info@redharbour.org, and we will try and get back to you. And we'll certainly, I think offline, we'll take this further and look at all the chat, and we'll certainly feedback to you all. So thank you very much. Just to say, on leaving the room, there will be a short survey on how you found today's session. It'd be great if you could complete that. And thank you again for all coming to attending this afternoon. And we look forward to welcoming you again. Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks very much. Thanks very much. Bye-bye.